I have been watching something unfold over the past several years that I initially dismissed as incompetence. Policy missteps, electoral noise, the kind of strategic drift that happens when domestic politics consumes a nation's bandwidth. But I can no longer maintain that interpretation. What I am tracking now is not drift. It is not accident. The pattern is too consistent, the outcomes too predictable, and the course corrections too absent to attribute this to mere confusion. The United States of America appears to be systematically dismantling the very architecture that made it the most powerful nation in human history. And the question I keep returning to is not whether this is happening, because the evidence is overwhelming that it is. The question is why. What incentive structure, what ideological framework, what strategic calculation could possibly explain why a nation at the peak of its power would voluntarily surrender the instruments of that power? Let me be clear about what I mean by power in this context. I am not talking about military capacity alone, though that matters. I am talking about the full spectrum of what international relations scholars call structural power. The ability to shape the rules of the game, the ability to determine what choices other nations face, the ability to make your currency the world's reserve, the ability to make your alliances the default security architecture, the ability to make your technology platforms the global standard, the ability to make your capital markets the place where the world stores its savings. These are not gifts that history bestowed upon America. They were built deliberately over decades through strategic investment, institutional design, and the careful cultivation of trust. And they are now being abandoned at a pace that would have seemed unthinkable even 5 years ago. I want to walk through the mechanics of this abandonment because I think most analysis misses the structural depth of what is occurring. The surface-level narrative focuses on individual policy decisions, tariff announcements, alliance tensions, rhetorical provocations. But these individual decisions are symptoms of something deeper. They are the visible expressions of a fundamental reorientation in how American leadership conceptualizes the relationship between national interest and global order. For 70 years, the operating assumption was that American power was enhanced by global engagement, that the costs of maintaining alliances, underwriting security guarantees, and sustaining international institutions were investments that paid returns in the form of influence, stability, and economic access. That assumption has been abandoned, not modified, not updated, abandoned. The first domain where I track this abandonment is alliance management. The United States built the most extensive network of formal and informal alliances in human history. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization alone represents a security commitment to 32 nations. Add bilateral treaties with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and others, and you have a system that effectively guarantees the security of most of the world's advanced economies. This system was not charity, it was leverage. It gave the United States veto power over the security policies of its allies. It meant that Germany could not develop nuclear weapons without American consent. It meant that Japan's military posture required American approval. It meant that the entire security architecture of Europe and Asia was designed around American preferences. That leverage is now being squandered. I have tracked the statements coming from Washington regarding alliance commitments, and the pattern is unmistakable. Conditionality has replaced commitment. Where once the message was that an attack on one is an attack on all, the message now is that support depends on payment, alignment, and obedience. This is not how alliances work. Alliances function because they are credible, because adversaries believe that attacking a treaty ally will trigger a response. The moment that credibility becomes conditional, the alliance loses most of its deterrent value, and the nations protected by that alliance begin to make alternative arrangements. I am already watching this happen. European defense spending is rising not because Europe suddenly loves military budgets, but because European capitals are no longer certain that America will honor its commitments. Japan is revising its constitutional interpretation of military force. South Korea is debating nuclear weapons. Australia is investing in long-range strike capabilities it never previously considered necessary. These are not signs of alliance health. They are signs of alliance failure. The second domain is economic architecture. The United States dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency. This is arguably the single greatest source of American structural power. It means that the United States can borrow in its own currency at rates no other nation can match. It means that American financial sanctions have teeth because most international transactions clear through American connected systems. It means that the United States exports its inflation to the rest of the world while importing real goods. This is an extraordinary privilege, and it was earned through decades of policy predictability, institutional credibility, and the perception that dollar-denominated assets were safe. That perception is now under sustained assault from American policy itself. I am watching the weaponization of the dollar accelerate in ways that I believe will prove self-defeating. When the United States froze Russian central bank reserves after the invasion of Ukraine, it demonstrated something that every foreign central bank immediately understood. Dollar reserves are not actually reserves if they can be confiscated at American discretion. Now, I am not arguing that the freeze was wrong. There are legitimate arguments for using financial weapons against aggression. What I am arguing is that every use of this weapon accelerates the search for alternatives. China is settling more trade in yuan. The BRICS nations are discussing payment systems that bypass the dollar. Central banks are accumulating gold at rates not seen in decades. None of these alternatives are ready to replace the dollar. But the trend is unmistakable. And it is being accelerated by American policy choices that treat the dollar's reserve status as an inexhaustible resource rather than a depletable asset. The third domain is institutional legitimacy. The United States designed the post-World War II institutional order, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the entire alphabet soup of international governance. These institutions were not neutral. They were designed to reflect American preferences and to amplify American influence. The voting weights at the International Monetary Fund give the United States an effective veto. The location of most major institutions in Washington or New York ensures American access. The rules these institutions enforce generally align with American economic philosophy. This was strategic investment, not altruism, and it paid enormous returns for decades. That investment is now being written off. I have tracked American engagement with international institutions over the past several years, and the pattern is withdrawal, criticism, and obstruction. Appointments to key positions are delayed or blocked. Funding commitments are questioned or reduced. The very legitimacy of multilateral governance is publicly challenged. Now, I understand the critique. Many of these institutions have become sclerotic. They often fail to deliver on their mandates. Reform is genuinely needed, but there is a difference between reform and abandonment. Reform preserves influence while improving function. Abandonment creates a vacuum that others will fill, and others are filling it. China has created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The new development bank serves the BRICS nations. Regional arrangements are proliferating that exclude American participation. Each of these developments represents a transfer of influence away from American-designed architecture toward alternatives that do not embed American preferences. The fourth domain is technological leadership. For decades, the United States led the world in innovation. Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Massachusetts, the research universities, the venture capital ecosystem, the ability to attract global talent. This was not just economic advantage, it was strategic advantage. The nation that leads in technology shapes the future. It sets standards, it creates dependencies, it generates the tools of both commerce and warfare. American technological leadership was sustained by openness, by welcoming the world's brightest minds, by allowing ideas to flow relatively freely, by creating an environment where risk-taking was rewarded and failure was tolerated. I am now watching that openness contract. Visa restrictions are making it harder for talented individuals to study and work in the United States. Research collaborations are being scrutinized and sometimes prohibited. The rhetoric around technology has shifted from competition to confrontation. Now, some of this is justified. There are legitimate national security concerns about technology transfer. There are real risks in certain research collaborations, but the implementation has been clumsy, broad, and self-defeating. When a brilliant graduate student from India cannot get a visa to study at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that student does not cease to exist. That student goes to Toronto or London or Singapore. The talent that America rejects does not disappear. It goes elsewhere and enriches competitors. Let me now map the actors involved in this transformation, because I think it is important to understand that this is not the work of any single administration or party. The incentive structures driving American withdrawal are bipartisan and structural. The first actor is the American electorate itself. Polling data consistently shows that American public opinion has shifted against international engagement. Majorities express skepticism about alliance commitments. Majorities favor reducing foreign entanglements. Majorities prioritize domestic spending over international investment. This is not irrational. American workers have experienced decades of wage stagnation while watching manufacturing jobs relocate overseas. They have seen the costs of military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq without clear benefits. They have experienced the social disruptions of globalization without adequate support for adaptation. Their skepticism is earned, but their skepticism is also being exploited by political entrepreneurs who offer withdrawal as a solution to problems that withdrawal will only worsen. The second actor is the political class that responds to this electorate. Both major parties have moved in the direction of skepticism about international engagement. The Republican Party has largely abandoned its post-World War II consensus on internationalism. The Democratic Party, while more rhetorically committed to alliances, has also moved toward protectionism and industrial policy that signal reduced confidence in open markets. Neither party is offering a serious defense of the architecture that American strategists spent decades building. Neither party is explaining to voters why that architecture serves American interests. Neither party is willing to pay the political price of defending unpopular but strategically essential commitments. The third actor is the economic elite that has become disconnected from national strategy. For most of the post-war period, American business leaders understood that their success depended on American power. They supported alliance commitments because alliances created stable markets. They supported international institutions because institutions created predictable rules. They supported immigration because immigration brought talent. That alignment has fractured. Corporate interests have become genuinely global in ways that sometimes conflict with national strategy. Companies optimize for shareholder returns, not for national power. Executives who spend more time in Shanghai than in Sheboygan naturally develop different priorities than executives whose businesses depend on American labor and American markets. I am not arguing that this is treasonous. I am arguing that it represents a structural shift in the incentive alignment between American capital and American strategy. The fourth actor is the national security establishment itself. I have spoken with enough current and former officials to know that there is genuine alarm within the institutions responsible for American security. But that alarm is not translating into effective resistance or course correction. The bureaucracy is divided. Career officials are demoralized. The expertise that took decades to develop is being lost as experienced personnel leave government service. The institutional capacity to execute sophisticated strategy is degrading, and the political leadership to which the bureaucracy reports is either indifferent to or actively hostile toward the preservation of American global architecture. I want to be precise about what I can and cannot verify regarding intent. I cannot prove that any individual decision-maker is consciously seeking to destroy American power. What I can observe is that decisions are being made whose predictable consequence is the destruction of American power, and that those consequences are not triggering course corrections. This pattern is consistent with several possible explanations. It could reflect genuine ideological conviction that American global engagement was always a mistake and that withdrawal serves American interests. It could reflect short-term political calculation that prioritizes domestic audiences over strategic outcomes. It could reflect capture by interests that benefit from chaos and disruption. It could reflect simple incompetence combined with ideological rigidity that prevents learning from failure. I lean toward a synthesis of these explanations. I believe there is a genuine ideological current in American politics that views the post-war order as having enriched elites at the expense of ordinary citizens. I believe this ideology has captured significant portions of both parties. I believe it is being amplified by political incentives that reward confrontation over cooperation. And I believe that the institutional guardrails that might have contained this ideology have been weakened to the point where they no longer function effectively. This is not a conspiracy. It is an emergent outcome of structural forces that have been building for decades. Let me now address the escalation dynamics because the pattern I am tracking is not static. It is accelerating. Each step away from international engagement makes the next step easier. Each breach of alliance credibility makes the next breach less costly. Each use of economic weapons makes alternatives more attractive. We are in a feedback loop where withdrawal begets withdrawal, and the second-order effects of this feedback loop are only beginning to manifest. The most immediate escalation risk is in Europe. The security architecture that has kept Europe peaceful for 70 years depends on American commitment. If that commitment becomes unreliable, European nations face a choice. They can accelerate their own defense capabilities, which will take years and consume resources that could otherwise address domestic priorities. They can seek accommodation with Russia, which would represent a fundamental shift in the European balance of power. Or they can attempt to muddle through, hoping that American commitment returns before a crisis tests it. None of these options is attractive. All of them represent a diminution of American influence in a region that has been central to American strategy for 3/4 of a century. The second escalation risk is in Asia. The nations of East Asia have oriented their security policies around American presence for decades. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Singapore, Australia all have made strategic choices premised on American reliability. If that reliability is questioned, each of these nations must recalculate. Japan and South Korea could pursue nuclear weapons. Taiwan could seek accommodation with Beijing. The Philippines could tilt toward China. Australia could attempt strategic neutrality. Each of these outcomes would represent a catastrophic loss for American influence and would create a regional order far less favorable to American interests than the current arrangement. The third escalation risk is economic. The dollar's reserve status depends on confidence. Confidence depends on predictability. Predictability depends on institutional stability. All of these factors are now in question. I am not predicting an imminent dollar collapse. The alternatives are not ready. The infrastructure for a post-dollar world does not yet exist. But the trajectory is clear. Every act of financial weaponization accelerates de-dollarization. Every breach of institutional norms reduces confidence. Every unpredictable policy announcement makes the dollar less attractive as a store of value. The process is gradual until it is not. Currency transitions in history have often featured long periods of stability followed by rapid shifts when confidence finally breaks. I cannot predict when that inflection point might arrive, but I can observe that current policies are bringing it closer. Let me construct 3 scenarios for how this might unfold because I think scenario thinking is more honest than prediction. The first scenario is managed correction. In this scenario, American political leadership recognizes the strategic damage being done and reverses course. Alliance commitments are reaffirmed with credibility. Institutional engagement resumes. The weaponization of economic tools is constrained. Immigration policy returns to a posture of selective openness. This scenario requires a significant political shift, either through electoral outcomes or through a crisis that clarifies the costs of current policies. I estimate the probability of this scenario at perhaps 20%. The structural forces driving withdrawal are strong, and I see limited evidence of political willingness to pay the costs of reversal. The second scenario is prolonged decline. In this scenario, current trends continue without dramatic acceleration. The United States remains powerful but less influential. Alliances persist but with reduced credibility. The dollar remains dominant but with growing competition. Institutions continue to function but with declining effectiveness. American technological leadership continues but with narrowing margins. This is a scenario of slow erosion rather than sudden collapse. It could persist for decades. It represents a gradual transfer of influence from the United States to a more diffuse set of powers, primarily China, but also India, regional blocs, and middle powers that exploit American withdrawal to expand their own influence. I estimate the probability of this scenario at perhaps 50%. It is the path of least resistance given current political incentives. The third scenario is systemic crisis. In this scenario, the erosion of American power triggers a cascade of failures, a test of alliance credibility that the United States fails to meet. A currency crisis triggered by loss of confidence in dollar-denominated assets. A technological disruption that shifts the balance of innovation to competitors. A conflict that reveals the hollowing out of American military capacity. Any of these triggers could create feedback effects that accelerate the decline. Allies that lose confidence defect, markets that lose confidence sell, competitors that sense weakness probe. The international order that American power underwrites fragments into regional spheres and competing blocs. I estimate the probability of this scenario at perhaps 30%, and I believe that probability is rising with each month of current policies. I want to close with a system-level observation about what is at stake. The post-World War II order was not perfect. It featured interventions that caused enormous harm. It enabled exploitation alongside stability. It privileged certain interests over others. All of this is true, but it also delivered 70 years without great power war. It enabled unprecedented economic development across much of the world. It created space for billions of people to rise from poverty. It established norms against conquest and aggression that, however imperfectly enforced, constrained the worst impulses of powerful states. This order was underwritten by American power, not because America was uniquely virtuous, but because American power was sufficient. American interests were broadly aligned with systemic stability, and American institutions were credible enough that other nations could coordinate around them. What I am watching now is the unraveling of that underwriting, and I want to be clear about what I do not know. I do not know whether the order that replaces American hegemony will be better or worse. I do not know whether the conflicts that American presence suppressed will erupt or remain dormant. I do not know whether the alternatives being developed by China and others will prove more effective or less effective at managing global challenges. These are questions that history will answer. What I can observe is that the transition period will be dangerous, that the erosion of established rules creates space for opportunism, that the weakening of deterrence invites testing, that the fragmentation of economic systems reduces efficiency and increases friction. Whether these costs will ultimately be outweighed by benefits, I cannot assess. But I can assess that the costs are coming and that current American policy is accelerating their arrival. The question I posed at the beginning was why? Why would a nation at the peak of its power voluntarily surrender the instruments of that power? I have offered structural explanations: shifting public opinion, political entrepreneurship, elite fragmentation, institutional decay, ideological capture. But I want to offer one additional observation. Perhaps the question itself contains a flawed assumption. Perhaps power was never as secure as it appeared. Perhaps the costs of maintaining the post-war order were always accumulating in ways that eventually became unsustainable. Perhaps what looks like voluntary surrender is actually the delayed recognition that the burdens of hegemony had become unbearable. If this is true, then the relevant question is not why America is abandoning power, but whether any power can sustain hegemony indefinitely, and what happens when hegemony ends. I do not have definitive answers. What I have is a commitment to tracking what unfolds, to analyzing the structural forces at work, and to offering the clearest picture I can of a world in transformation. The next months and years will reveal whether the pattern I have identified accelerates, stabilizes, or reverses. I will be watching the alliance commitments, I will be watching the currency flows, I will be watching the institutional engagements, I will be watching the technological indicators, and I will continue to share what I learn. Because if there is one thing I am certain of, it is that understanding what is happening is the necessary first step to adapting to what comes next.